Hey everyone, my name's Alex Blanc. I'm a 3D environment and prop artist, and I recently had the incredible opportunity to work alongside Carlos Coronado, who's an amazing developer and Unreal Engine master. Lately, he has been working on many different tools to streamline development in Unreal Engine 5, and one of those is the Edge Decal Tool, which I created the texture for, and in this video I'm going to explain how I did it. So the workflow I used is pretty much the standard PBR high to low baking pipeline. And the first thing I need is the base mesh the tool uses. So in order to get that, we're going to first make sure that the plugin is active in our scene. We can do that by making sure it appears on the plugins page and it is active. Once we have made sure that it appears there, we can go to scriptable tools to open up the tool. We go to the edge tool setting, and we can browse to the location of the decal mesh. Once there, we can go to Asset Actions, and we can export to our desired location. Once I had my mesh, I imported it into ZBrush so I could start sculpting. In order to do that, we're going to go to the Import tool under the toolbar. We're going to select where we saved our base mesh. We don't need to import anything other than just the tool. So we're just going to click OK, making sure none of the options are actually enabled. And we're just going to drag it and go into the edit mode. That way we have our mesh here. Since this is a pretty low poly mesh, what I did is I went into geometry and I first of all remeshed it just so I could get a bit higher polygonization and preserve the detail on the edges. I then used the smooth brush and I smoothed basically the creases that appear on the low poly, because otherwise once we dynamesh it or we divide it, it's gonna look a bit too low poly and the edges are gonna stand up way too much. And after that, what I did is I basically used dynamesh to sculpt. Since I wanted to introduce a lot of detail with both alphas and manual sculpting, what I did is I basically set the resolution on the dynamesh to the maximum amount that it can handle. In this case 4K, which will give us a mesh of around 4 million polygons. Once our mesh hit our desired polygon after dynamesh, what we can do is we can actually start adding detail. So in this case, in order to add detail, I used a combination of different brushes, both standard brushes that come from ZBrush, like Trim Dynamic or a lot of trim brushes, polish brushes, as well as using some custom brushes. In this case, some of them I gotten from Gumroad. Other ones I created them by using alphas from pictures I found either on the internet or pictures I took around town. And I could create cracks and small crevices like this. After I was done with the detail, what I could do is I could head to Z plugin to decimate the mesh in order to export it. So in order to do that, we're going to head to Z plugin, Decimation Master. We're going to pre-process. You will see right here that it will start processing and it will give you a percentage. Once it finished pre-processing, I could finally decimate it. So we see right here that it is hovering around 4 million polygons. What I like to do is I'd like to just decimate it once. It will give us around 700 to 800 polygons. In this case, this is where I found I could keep the highest amount of micro detail without the bake taking too long. And so I left it like that. Once this was done, what I could do is I could export the mesh. In order to do that, we're going to head to Z plugin again. And in this case, we're going to select the FBX Export Import plugin. And we're just going to click on export and export our mesh to the desired location. As with everything, when it comes to 3D, there are many different ways to approach each step. In my case, I opted for baking the high poly mesh using Substance Painter, but this can be done by using pretty much any software capable of baking mesh maps. There were a couple of things I needed to take into account. One was the fact that when remeshing and dividing meshes in ZBrush, they can sometimes shrink or create artifacts like we can see here on the edges. What I had to do in this case is, since the detail also has a bit of an inset part, like in this case where it shows some plaster being built and the concrete underneath, I imported all of my high poly meshes as well as the low poly one into a scene in 3ds Max, but as I said previously, you can use any software of your choice. And what I did was I made sure that they were slightly separated. There are different ways to approach this step. Sometimes you can use custom cages, but since in this case this is a pretty simple mesh, I just opted for importing it and giving it a slight offset like we can see here. This can create a couple of other issues, but they can be solved by other means. So in this case, for example, on the edges of the mesh, since this is offset, we will have a slight part where the rays don't go through the high poly mesh and bake onto the low poly, and thus there will be some baking errors on this edge right here. But since we're using an opacity map and all of this won't be shown in the engine, this is not a problem. Another thing that I had to take into account was the fact that sometimes if I baked on the x-axis with the edges being at the same position, when shown in the engine, the texture sometimes would show a seam right here. So what I did in this case is I offset it just by a slight percentage. In this case, you can see the percentage of the scaling on the x-axis is 102 instead of 100. That way it would overlap the high poly on top of the low poly, and there wouldn't be any sort of errors on the x-axis. Once I had my high poly mesh the way I wanted it to, we could export it. So in this case, since I'm using 3ds Max, what I want to do is I want to select the high poly mesh that I wanted to export with the offset already applied to it. We go into File, and we can export selected, and we can save it to the desired path. Baking the meshes is quite easy with the previous preparation, but there's still a couple of things that have to be taken into account when preparing the Substance Painter scene. The first thing we need to make sure is that the template we're using is a PBR template with alpha blending enabled, so we can actually use the opacity channel. And after that, we need to make sure that the file we're using is our low poly file that we exported from Unreal Engine. We can disable auto unwrap, and we can click OK. Since the textures that the tool uses are actually not square, they are 256 by 2K, what we need to do is we need to go to the texture set settings and we need to modify it right here. When they are square, this is actually locked, so we can unlock it. We can set it to 256 by 2K. Also here in this case, we have the opacity channel. If you don't have it right here, you can actually add this channel. And right now we're gonna just head into baking. So in the baking menu, what we're gonna need to do is we're gonna select our high poly mesh. In this case, we're gonna use the one that we used previously, which is this one. And as we can see here, it already figures as offset. Like we mentioned, we will get some errors right here because the meshes are not colliding, and we can just adjust the frontal distance and the back distance, although the last one is not as important since we're just going to be looking at it from this angle. We need to make sure that all the channels that we want are actually baking. In this case, opacity map is the one that we're going to paint ourselves, so it is not necessary for us to just bake it. And what I like to do as well is on the bake settings, I like to make sure that I bake on the highest resolution possible. When we export it, it is better for, or at least this is how I've been taught, it is better for us to actually bake at a higher resolution and then downsize the texture size when we export it, rather than just bake at the same export quality and then with image compression in the case that we need to use it for some case, we would lose some quality. So I'd rather just bake at 8K and then export at the lower resolution that we set previously. After the bake was done and I was happy with the result, I started texturing. As these textures are relatively simple, I relied on a lot of references which I had previously gathered both from searching online as well as by taking photos of the ones I could find around town. As I mentioned previously, some of these photos I also used in order to create alphas in Photoshop so I could turn them into brushes in ZBrush. Regarding the textures, I mostly use procedural noises and then I played around with the roughness values for the small details as well as the overall colors. I also use some filters regarding edge wearing, ambient occlusion. It depended on the detail that I wanted to express in the mesh that I was using. It varied from high poly mesh to high poly mesh. As we can see here also, we have the aforementioned baking errors on the edges. In this case, whenever I finished texturing and I was happy with the result, I painted the opacity channel That way those are not shown. You can see here, while the mesh is this big, we actually do not use this information when using textures overlapped on it. So it is not visible, and thus it is not a problem. Regarding the x-axis in this case, this part right here would be the one that would tile inside the engine, and I tried to leave as little detail there as possible just so you could not see the seam and it is as hidden as possible. Once I was happy with texturing, I exported the maps. So in order to do that, I needed to create a custom template. In order for them to work in the tool, we needed to set a total of 3 different maps. One would be the base color, then we would have the normal map, and then we would have a mask map, which has the metallic, ambient occlusion, opacity, and roughness maps in the red, green, blue, and alpha channel respectively. With my textures done, I could configure the materials in Unreal Engine. Since the master material was already created by Carlos, I just didn't need to tinker with materials, I just needed to instance them and use the textures on them. So in order to do that, we can again go to Scriptable Tools, go to the Edge Decal part, and we need to locate the master material, in this case mesh decal _ master. In order to create an instance, we can just click this button right here, Material Instance, save it to where we want it saved. And in this case, since the ones that I want to show are already created, I can just head to the folder where they are saved. We can see there's a folder for each one of those, and we can select it. You will see there's 2 options. One where there's just a normal map, so in this case we do not have the base color option, and another one where all the 3 maps are active. We can see there's a base color 1, a mask map 1, and a normal one. The material is already to set up to interpret the mask map and assign it to each one of the channels, so we don't need to do anything else. And in this case, if we want to modify a little bit of material to see where the roughness or ambient occlusion intensity, select the material that we want. Let's go with a worn concrete, for example, and we can start using the tool. It is as easy as this. Once we have it done, we can just click on accept, and we can see here we get this result. There's a lot of extra tools that we can use. So, for example, instancing the mesh, and a lot of other stuff that Carlos goes a lot more in depth in his tutorials, as well as the documentation for the tool. And you can check those out if you need further information. And lastly, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful to any of you that might want to recreate this part for yourself. And thanks for watching.